County Court of Common Pleas is again in session. Honorable Christine Croce presiding.
Thank you. You may be seated. All right, Mr. Gorman, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, everybody. Attorney Riley and I, throughout the course of this trial, and I know we started way back on August 16th, I think that's when we met you folks. We've, as the prosecutors have paid attention to how you're receiving evidence, the attention that you're paying to this case. And we want to, on behalf of our client, thank you for the energy that we can feel that you have brought to the table in this case, this very, very important matter. As I said in Ladir, this is the most important weeks of Mr. Ford's life. And I know the prosecutors will say, well, this is the most important weeks for the victims as well. But they're not on trial right now. Mr. Ford is. The burden of proof in this case, folks, let's not forget, because I heard a lot of shifting going on with the prosecutor's closing argument, telling us why the burden's over here and the suspects are no good, and you shouldn't consider the suspects in this case. Well, I'm here to tell you that the burden of proof here remains on this side of the table. You must find him not guilty unless they can prove to you beyond a reasonable doubt that he's the guy that went to these houses and started these fires. They've got to prove it to you. Our job isn't to prove one thing to you. And that's why the judge gave you an instruction that Mr. Ford didn't even have to testify. He doesn't have to testify because he has no burden of proof. He doesn't have to prove anything to you in this case. What we have to show you is, in like every case in the history of the United States, criminal case, is we have to show you there's reasonable doubt. I don't have all the answers. Mr. Riley doesn't have all the answers. These folks don't have all the answers. That's why there's reasonable doubt in this case. The suspects that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to touch on in closing argument, were created by the defense. They were created by the state of Ohio, by the Akron Police Department. They want to talk about following the evidence. We are simply following the evidence. I don't have to tell you it was this suspect. I don't have to tell you it was that suspect. I don't have to tell you who it was. You could theoretically think that they've proven by something less than proof beyond a reasonable doubt that maybe it was even Stanley. And it's still a not guilty verdict. The reason we point these suspects out and we point out the lack of investigation as it relates to the rest of the suspects is because it creates doubt. Can I sit here and tell you it was one person and not the other? I cannot. That's what God's for. Someone's going to have to answer to God someday for what happened on that street in both 2016 and 2017. That's not our job. Our job is to be analytical. Our job is to take this as an academic exercise and to hold the state of Ohio to its burden of proof. To its burden of proof. And to do that, you have to look at the entire investigation. And I warned you, I said it's uncomfortable, but to look at the entire investigation, you have to be critical of it. You have to be critical of what the police did or did not do in this case. They've identified some suspects, they never followed up with them. We're going to talk about that. It's not because I don't like the police, it's because they didn't do their job here. I want you to think about this. In 2016, they had all of those suspects. And they had Stanley Ford as a suspect in 2016. And nobody got arrested. Nobody. Because they didn't think they had probable cause to even charge anybody. 2016, no one gets arrested. 2017 in January, there's a car fire. Nobody gets arrested. 2017 in May, there's a house fire. There is an incredible amount of pressure on the Akron Police Department to arrest somebody. Once they make that decision, they don't care about the other possible suspects. They don't look at the other possible suspects. They don't even focus on the other suspects. They don't even check their alibis, and we're going to talk about that. An incredible amount of pressure to arrest somebody. And the easiest guy is the guy that's living actually in the neighborhood. The one suspect that they have for sure that's living in the neighborhood. But think about what they haven't done in this case, please. If you consider what they haven't done in this case, and what they should have done in this case, once again, it doesn't make me happy to point that out. But it creates reasonable doubt. Now, I told you in voir dire about reasonable doubt, and I want to touch on this before we get to the other suspects and the lack of a police investigation here. I want to focus on that. I told you in voir dire that there are different levels of proof depending on the level or the kind of case we have in our justice system or our legal system. I talked to you about preponderance of the evidence, and I talked to you about if you're suing somebody for money damages, you have to prove by a little bit more than not, right? And I talked to you about clear and convincing evidence. And I told you in voir dire that the state of Ohio can theoretically prove by clear and convincing evidence that Stanley Ford was the guy, if you thought that. And you would still have to vote not guilty because clear and convincing evidence is a lesser burden of proof than proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is our highest burden of proof. So even if you thought it was in that range, you still have to say not guilty, once again, because we're not all-powerful, we don't see, we don't have videotape, we're not eyewitnesses, and we're not God. So in the greatest country in the history of civilization, believe me, there's a lot of flaws in it. In the greatest country, the greatest legal system ever known to mankind, we don't make the defendant prove he didn't do it. We make them prove he did do it to take away his freedom, or to kill him potentially in this case. We make them prove it, and if they haven't proven it by that standard, we come back and say not guilty. That's what makes us a civilization, the best country in the world, a civilized society. We hold them to their burden of proof. So if they've proven it to you by preponderance of the evidence in your mind, it's not guilty. They've proven it to you by clear and convincing evidence, it's not guilty. That's why it's important to criticize the investigation. That's why it's important to criticize the things that they did not do in this case. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt, the prosecutor put it up there. Proof of such nature and of such character that an ordinary person, folks, that's you or I, that's us, that we would be willing to rely and act upon that level of proof in deciding the most important of our own personal affairs in our lives. Think about that. Proof of such character that we would be willing to rely and act upon it in deciding the most important matters in our own lives. Now, the prosecutor will tell you, and they often do, well, we use that in traffic cases. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It's not such a great level of burden of proof. We know, number one, it's higher than clear and convincing evidence. That sounds like an awful lot of proof, doesn't it? Number one. And number two, in a traffic case, you know what you have? You have a law enforcement officer often on the side of the road, eyes on the infraction that's being committed, with a videotape of the infractions being committed. And oh, by the way, he probably has a laser gun, scientific proof that the speeding or whatever it was being committed. That's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It doesn't matter if it's a traffic case or a death penalty case, the burden of proof stays the same. But that's why it's not a lessening of the burden to think about that. And I bring it up because often, and I know this, we get to sit down and they get to stand up again and rebuttal and say things like that. Now, I don't know if Mr. LaPrenzi was going to say it or not, but I'm talking about it now because I can't stand back up and I can't tell you what my response to what he has to say is. And I want you to keep that in mind as we go through this process. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Let's, God forbid, one of us, has a loved one who's on life support in a coma. God forbid. And we have to decide whether or not we're going to crudely pull that plug. That could be one of the most important of our own personal affairs. I'm just taking the definition. That's the definition of it. And if we have to make that decision, we probably want to know from 2 or 3 neurologists or neurosurgeons, whoever they might be, that they don't believe by medical evidence or scientific evidence that our loved one is ever going to come out of that coma. Because if they thought otherwise, we wouldn't pull that plug, would we? That might be one of the most important of our own personal affairs, and that's the level of convincing that we have to make that decision for our loved one. The law says that's the level of certainty you have to have that they have proven to you that he did these things to say guilty. It's the same thing. It's an example of it. Think about that level of proof in deciding this case. So, when I talk to you about the other suspects, I don't talk to you because I'm pointing the finger at one of them and saying, I know they did it. I don't know. That would be a lie. We don't know. But they have to be taken into consideration in the context of, have they proven their case beyond a reasonable doubt, or are there other legitimate possibilities in this case? Now, sometimes, and the judge will tell you, you have to take the evidence for what comes from that witness stand. And sometimes we don't have all the evidence that we want to have as jurors in making our decision, because sometimes the police department doesn't finish the job and give us the rest of the information. And because they haven't given us the rest of the information, that can create reasonable doubt in a case, because we don't have those answers. So let's talk about first the 2016 fire, if you will. Let's talk about Thomas Hughley and Ronald Garrett. Thomas Hughley and Ronald Garrett, we know, lived in the basement of 719 Bolts. Thomas Hughley, we only heard his statement because, unfortunately, he passed since of other causes, but we heard his written statement. Thomas Hughley, just because he's gone, folks, doesn't mean we can't be critical of him. Just because he's gone, he doesn't tell us the truth in that statement all the time. He was asked by me when I cross-examined him, when we read it in here, he was asked about the partying that goes on in that house. And he denied it. He said, nah, we didn't do that. That's not true. Those guys were drug addicts. They were transients. And I'm not putting them down, I'm telling you the facts of life. They were transients, they were drug addicts, and they lived in that basement. And how do we know that? We know that because you heard me question the detectives in this case about Gregory Lewis. Gregory Lewis was the brother of Lindell, who had also lived in that house a year prior. He got the heck out of there because he said Thomas Hughley and Ronald Garrett were pissing off their drug dealers because they were taking their drugs on consignment and they weren't paying for them after the fact. And that there was confrontations at 719 Bolts. That's what we learned. We not only learned that from him, but we learned that from the guy that installed the videos, Mr. Sibley, too. He said, I was a drug addict. I know that there were drug addicts and prostitution going on in that house. We heard from the neighbors that called it a wild bunch. So Mr. Hughley, just because he's gone doesn't mean we have to believe everything he said in his statement. He didn't tell us the truth about what was happening there. And when he goes on to say that Joe McLemore had made up with Lindell Lewis, how can we hang our hat on that? The guy didn't tell us the truth. He didn't tell the detectives the truth that day about his own drug addiction, about owning drug dealers. We can't trust that. Why is that important? It's important because after Tanisha Stewart learns from Gregory Lewis about what's actually happening at that house, she never goes back and interviews Thomas Hughley again. She never goes back and interviews Ronald Garrett again and asks them, who did you owe this money to? Who did you have these conflicts with at the house about the drugs that you owed? The physical confrontation. Who was it with? If I'm an Akron police detective, I kind of want to know. I want to know who had motivation, motive. The prosecutor talks about motive. Let's talk about motive. Who had that motive? We don't know. You know why? Because they didn't do their job. They could have asked those drug dealers. They could have gotten those names. They could have saw where their whereabouts maybe were. They could have asked them for their alibi and then tried to confirm it or deny it. They did none of that. Speaking of drug dealers, we have another one that Timothy Gary tells us about, and that's Anthony, the self-proclaimed biggest drug dealer in town, who lives on Russell. No one ever speaks to Anthony. Not once. Not once, even though their witnesses are telling their detectives about these folks. Not once do they do that. Don't you want to know what those people would say? Don't you want to know where they would have been? Maybe. The Circle K guys. The prosecutor wants to say they got different clothes on. I look at that picture, I don't know if those were covers, overalls, or whatever it was that was put on the person that said 19 volts. We don't know whether they took those clothes off before they went into Circle K. We have no idea. And as the prosecutor rightfully points out, we don't know if it's a third person in that truck. We have no idea. Here's what Detective Looney told us, though. Detective Looney told us that we actually had a name of one of those guys that was in the truck. And I said, Detective Looney, what did you do to follow up? Well, I made a call. They wouldn't talk to me. Really? Stanley Ford didn't want to talk to him either, did he? What did he do? He drug Stanley Ford down to the police station. What did Detective Looney do with the Circle K guy? Absolutely nothing. Nothing. How about that guy's background? Maybe we should know about it. We do know that he deals drugs down the street, though. And we do know that his truck was driven throughout that neighborhood, throughout the attempts on the fire. And we don't even bother to make him talk to us. Let's just forget about that. That's not important. How about going to Circle K, and how about talking to the clerk who served those guys that night? And how about finding out what they bought? How about reviewing the video and seeing whether or not they were putting gas in a gas can? How about doing something like that? How about pulling the DVR at Circle K? We know, folks, that DVRs, even if they're not functioning, like this one from Lindell Lewis's house, all burnt up, we know we can get days and days and days of video off this broken down, burned up DVR. That DVR at Circle K was never even considered. Don't we want to know who those people were that were at Circle K that were driving through that neighborhood over and over and over again that night, who were floating around that neighborhood, going in and out up East Avenue at the time of the commission of the fires? Isn't that reasonable doubt? Not even attempted. And he thought he had a name. He didn't even confirm whether the name was good or not. That's unacceptable in an aggravated murder death penalty case. Let's just put it on one guy. Ronald Garrett. Not only could his drug dealers have been mad, but we learned from Thomas Hughley something pretty important. We learned that Ronald Garrett, who lives in the house, for some reason, don't want to stay in the house that night. We learned from Thomas Hughley that he's cutting lawn. He's cutting a lawn over here, and he sees Ronald Garrett walking up 719 Fultz the evening before the fire starts. And then he goes, I don't see him again. He's gone. Ronald Garrett, folks, by Tanisha Stewart, is asked, where were you? He says, I was at my niece's house, and gives an address with an apartment number. It's a high-rise. And I asked Tanisha Stewart, did you talk to the niece to see if you could confirm that he actually stayed where he said he stayed the night of the fire? And she comes up with she sits here after we've heard from other officers. That's why I asked all the other officers, because I knew what she was going to do. And I talked about reports of investigation. And I talked about it being the Bible of what we do, so we can go look back years later and we can be fair both to the state and the defense. And she says, well, not everything makes it into my ROI. Not everything. That's a bunch of garbage. That's a garbage. That's what she tells you, folks, because she knows she didn't do it. Maybe I sent someone else off to look or to talk. I don't have it in my ROI. You are the lead detective in this case. And you can't tell us whether someone talked to Ronald Garrett's niece to see if he was in that apartment that night? I asked her about the video. Did you do the video? And she goes, well, you wouldn't really believe if a relative said it, they'd be covering. I said, okay, fair enough. You're in an apartment complex, an old folks home, and you know there's video, and she acknowledges that. Did someone watch the video? Well, I don't know, maybe someone did, it's just not my notes. We cleared it. You cleared it? Where is it? Where is it in your investigation you did these things to confirm his alibi? What if she would have looked at the video or talked to the niece and the guy was never there that night? The guy who lives at 719 Fultz who never comes home that night. And they want to say, well, he had some of his belongings downstairs, so therefore he couldn't have been a suspect. Where are the answers to these questions? We don't have them because they didn't do their job. Because they didn't do their job, there's reasonable doubt. Ronald McLemore. We know from Thomas Hughley that Ronald McLemore actually confessed to starting this house on fire a year or so earlier, along with a man, because he was angry as hell with Lindell Lewis. So angry that he took Thomas Hughley's gasoline that he used to cut, the grass man used to cut the neighborhood, and set the van on fire and tried to set the side of the house on fire, and Thomas Hughley said that's why we have to do aluminum siding. Because that man tried to burn Lindell Lewis out, because he thought Lindell Lewis stole $3,000 of his SSI money while Ronald McLemore sat in the Summit County Jail. And on top of that, mind-bogglingly, we also learned from the detectives and from other people, including Mr. Hughley, that McLemore also lived at another house owned by Lindell Lewis in the past, and on South Street. I specifically asked about it. And what did we learn, McLemore, what happened to that house that McLemore lived in too, owned by Lindell Lewis? That it burned up. McLemore is around 2 arsons, both as they relate to Lindell Lewis. Both of his properties, he lives in both of them, and they both burn up. What a coincidence that is. He's discounted as a suspect. They cleared him. Where was he that night? We checked at the Haven. He had been in the Haven for 3 or 4 days. Where was the re-interview of him? Where was the pressing of him like they pressed Mr. Ford over and over and over again, or where his whereabouts were? So we can check that out. Not done. Do I know that it's any of those 3 sets of drug dealers? No. Do I know that it's Ronald Garrett? No. Do I know that it's Mr. McLemore? Absolutely not. My job isn't to prove to you who did it. My job is to show you that there's reasonable doubt as to whether they can prove he did it. Francine Lewis and William Pryor. Do I know they did it? I know. What I do know is that Tanisha Stewart labeled them as suspects in her report of investigation in 2016. Why did she do that? Well, she tells us when I show up on scene in the morning and I'm starting my investigation, Francine Lewis is there, and unprompted, in other words, she didn't ask her any questions. The first thing out of Francine Lewis's mouth is, I had nothing to do with this. She said she found that pretty suspicious. I had nothing to do with this. She digs a little further, and she finds that Francine Lewis has a life insurance policy on Lindell Lewis that he doesn't know about. She digs a little bit further, and she finds out that her boyfriend is William Pryor. And I asked a specific question. We had to go to sidebar, but she was allowed to answer. And I said, Miss Stewart, when you interviewed William Pryor, you talked to him about a prior death, not that he committed a death, but he lied to you about how it happened, didn't he? You knew that as you sat in the interview that he was giving you false information. She said, yes. I knew he was lying. Before I forget, I'm jumping around and I apologize, stay with me. Ronald Garrett. Not only did they not get the video or talk to the niece, do any of those things, not only did they not do that, but she says, I wrote these down, in her report of investigation, it was apparent that they were withholding names and information. He was from the she interviewed him. He gave inconsistent answers to my questions. He was very elusive and vague when I questioned him. And he lacked a forthrightness. She concludes, I'm suspicious of him. Those were the detective's words about Ronald Garrett. Back to Francine Lewis and William Pryor. In her ROI, she didn't want to tell us this. I had made her get it out while she was whistling and humming and singing for some reason. I don't know why that was. That was the oddest behavior I've ever seen from a detective from a witness stand in my entire career. But that's what she was doing, whistling, humming, and singing from the witness stand. A little nervous, maybe? I asked her about William Pryor, and she said, well, they weren't the same age. I said, no, that's not what I'm talking about, detective. You're not answering my question. I said, I asked you what is in your report of investigation when you compared the physical description of William Pryor to Stanley Ford. And she says, in her report of investigation, in the so-called Bible, same age, approximate age, same complexion, same facial hair, and same build. Those are her words in her report of investigation. We know that William Pryor and Francine Lewis and Gloria Hart don't like each other either. I said, all of those things made them a suspect. First she said no. I said, you wrote it in your report they were suspects. You can't back off of that now. You said it yourself. I want you to forget about that. I want you to forget about all those things and rush to convict Mr. Ford. Nobody got arrested once again in 2016. Nobody got arrested in January 2017. Somebody was getting arrested in May of 2017 when that second house fire happened. Somebody was. Ronald Garrett, by the way, after the fire, they had to put out a be on the lookout for this guy. And they don't even get to talk to him for 4 days because he don't want to be interviewed. It's his house, they said it. It's his house, it's his belongings. Where the heck is he? They had to find him. Isn't that suspicious? Shouldn't he be back there if he's got these nice suits or whatever he says he's got in the basement and he wants them back? Someone burned out his house? Shouldn't he be there trying to help? Be on the lookout for him. They had to go find him. Why don't they go back after they talk to Greg Lewis and find out what's really happened at 719 Fultz and re-interview Hughley and Garrett? Why not? Nobody did. The only time anyone ever talked to Thomas Hughley was in the Akron Fire Department truck on the scene after he had to run out of a house and was under all kinds of stress. They never even went back and talked to this man. And he's in the indictment against Stanley Ford. Stanley's accused of attempted murder of him, and they took about 5 minutes to talk to him. what do we see in 2016? Tanisha Stewart, she identifies, I'm going to call it this, I'm going to leave it up to you folks to decide what it is that you're seeing. But we heard about infrared and the lights aren't all, the colors aren't always the same, and I agree with that. The colors aren't always the same. So do we know the color of the pickup truck? Well, we know the one from Circle K. We know that one. And it's a pretty good bet that the one at Circle K is also the one that's going through that neighborhood, because they have it leaving East Avenue, going down towards Circle K, and then a minute or two later, they get down the street and they're at Circle K. So it's a pretty good bet that the truck that we see in the neighborhood is, in fact, the truck that's at Circle K. She talks about it has a white stripe on the bottom of it. Remember she was saying that? White stripe, white stripe, white stripe. That's what we heard over and over and over again. White stripe. Maybe it is a white stripe, and maybe she's right. I don't even know. But we see in that neighborhood a truck that it probably is, the truck that's at Circle K. We also see after the second attempt on the fire, we see another truck. Now, could it be the same truck? It could, because here's what we know. We know, I don't know how to do that. Here's what we know. I've been waiting all trial to utilize this thing. This is my technology. So we know that East Avenue is up here and runs down here. We know that. There's East Avenue. We know that's Stan's house. We know that's Stan's mother's house. We know 719 Fultz is up here. We know 693 Fultz is up in this area. Russell, where the truck fire is. We know you can take, we've asked people to testify to this, you can take Russell Avenue to East Avenue and get out of this neighborhood by going down Russell. You can also come into this neighborhood by going down Russell, coming down this way and coming around this way, or coming up Hillcrest. We know that. So there's different avenues to get in and out. What we do know too is that we only have video down in this area from 714 Fultz, 2016 from 719 Fultz. We know that's where the videos are coming from, and they're facing this way. So we don't really know if somebody comes in the neighborhood by those videos anyway. We don't know if they came around this way. We don't know which way they came. We do know that down East Avenue down here would be Circle K. We don't know how they get in and out of the neighborhood, at what time do they actually get back to the neighborhood, unless we see from the video that they actually came in off East Avenue down Fultz. Then we can pick them up coming in and going. Other than that, we don't know. But what we do see on the video, is it the same truck? Is it not? Are they the same suspects as the drug dealers that live down here? The guys that we see in the truck? We don't know. But we do see a truck come down from this area, down Fultz, and turn around here and go back. Same truck or not? I don't know. But it looks like the person that's doing that is pulling up to here, and they're checking out to see whether or not 719 Fultz actually caught fire or not. That's what it looks like. And then turning around, and they figure out it didn't. And then after that, we get the third attempt on the house. The third attempt. That truck is suspicious as well. Could it be the same one? It could. Could it have different occupants in it? It could. Could those people in that truck that turned around be different than the ones? The drug dealer, if he is the drug boys, is what the prosecutor put up there. Could it be different? It could. Could it be the same? It could. We don't know. We don't know. But Daisia Stewart talks about these videos, and she concludes, and I went to her report, and she concludes in her reports that once the first and second fire was started, we had she says truck, now she says vehicle. But she says truck, and I pressed her on it. She goes, well, I can tell by the height of the suspension. I want you to watch those videos. You can't tell. I don't care who you are. You can't tell coming off of East Avenue that truck that stops, or vehicle that stops here, or car that stops here, turns off their lights, by the way. Turns off their lights, and you see, she puts this in her report, the person that starts the fire run back towards that truck turns around and goes back down East Avenue. She puts that in her report. Watch the video. You can't see though, and I don't know why she's got to make it up when she gets on the stand, that that's a truck. She wants to talk about the suspension size or how high the suspension is off the ground. She's going to tell us that's a truck. Why? Why did she do that? Is it because later on she wants to implicate Stanley O. Mitchell? Because he is a truck too? I don't know. I don't know why she's got to make it up. I don't know why she makes it up in her report. It doesn't make any sense. She also talks about a pathway that goes from this street past 1374, and it's an alleyway she describes, and I told her to show it to us, and she puts this, or tells us that there's a pathway that goes here, and you can actually go up, it's an old pathway, up into East Avenue. And she tells us after the third attempt, the successful attempt, that she believes that the car that was involved that helped the guy get away the first 2 times up in this area, that turned their lights off, that she believes that that car is actually in this alleyway at the time, and then the person comes down from the alleyway this way to start the fire and runs behind the house. That's what she tells us. Now she wants to say, in 2017, well, upon further review, forget about all that stuff. Forget about all that. Let's just focus on this guy right here. A year later. That's what she tells us. The videos that we have, 2016 fire, I want you to keep this in mind. We have one snapshot in time, the 1 hour around which time this fire was set. Because when they go to 714 Fultz, Chester Williams' house, on that day, they don't take the DVR. They put a little flash drive in and they only collect an hour's worth of time. It'd be nice to know what was happening in that neighborhood in the hours preceding that fire, wouldn't it? It might even be nice to know what happened in that neighborhood in the hours after that fire, even after the fire trucks left. But they didn't get that DVR at that time. They didn't do that until 2017. Why not? How about the DVR at 7:30 Fultz? And when this car pulls down the street, folks, it stops before it gets to 7:30. Like the car coming down the street that turns its lights off and turns around and flees with the person who's starting the fire, like that person, maybe knew there was video on that house. It's unplugged. That's all we know. Where's that DVR? If they can pull video off of this at the state chief fire marshal's office in Columbus, they can certainly pull it off a DVR if a camera's been unplugged. And who unplugged it? We don't know. What was on that DVR before it was unplugged? We don't know. We do know it was pointing right across the street towards 719 Fultz. It'd be nice to know that. It'd be nice to have that information, but Tanisha Stewart makes the decision not to even bother. She says, oh, when a citizen tells us that, we just trust them. That's what she said. That's ludicrous. This is an aggravated murder investigation. We just trusted it. That's a poor, poor investigation in 2016. Stanley O. Mitchell, they brought him up a little bit. I brought him up. Can I sit here and tell you Stanley O. Mitchell was involved in this case? They said, well, he doesn't have any motive. We don't know, first of all, what conversations he may have had with Mr. Ford. And Mr. Ford told him, I don't like people at 719 Fultz. We don't know that. It's not part of the evidence. Motive is not important. That's not the deciding factor here. Stanley O. Mitchell, here's what we know about him on that night. And they don't interview him for 14 months after the fact. 14 months. We learned that Stanley Mitchell is out of his house around the times of the fires, and we know that because he told the police that night, I had to go to work at McDonald's. And I asked Detective Looney, I said, that's about 6 to 8 minutes at best, hopping on East Avenue and going up to 76, that's 6 to 8 minutes away. And we know he clocks in at 4:02, Detective Looney told us that. They went and talked to him 14 months later as a potential suspect. 14 months. And they pull his records and they find out that he's there. What else does Detective Looney tell us? Detective Looney tells us that Stanley Mitchell most likely had access to 1370 and 1374 Hillcrest. That's what he told us. I don't know if Stanley Mitchell was involved in this case, just like I don't know if the rest of the suspects were involved in this case. And then they want to say, well, if he was involved, he was Stanley's accomplice, Stanley Ford's accomplice. How do we know that? How do we know he couldn't possibly be involved in this case and have a different accomplice? How do we know he wasn't the guy that turned off the lights here and turned around after whoever he was with ran towards him? They want you to conclude it has to be Stanley Ford. They don't have any proof of that. They just want you to conclude it. If he's got access to 1374 and 1370, he's got the key card, whatever it is, the code, he could have done it. It's possible. That's possible. Here's what's important, that key card, when they came in on alarm.com, I wanted to point out a few things. One of the things I wanted to point out, they just put the 3 dates up of the fires and say, well, it was disarmed. I want you to go back and I want you to look at all the months they had. There were many times over those months in the early morning hours where that alarm was deactivated. Many times in the early morning hours. That's why I asked him painstakingly, it was boring as heck probably to everybody, but I was asking, did you, on this date, at this time, didn't you see disarmed by Stanley Ford, disarmed by Stanley Ford, disarmed by Stanley Ford? Yes, yes, yes. It wasn't just those 3 nights in question. And on top of that, 5 or 6 months, you have the records, you'll see for yourself in 2017, they did from, I think it was July 1st of 2016 until January of 2017, they didn't even pull the records. We don't know how many times it was disarmed in the early morning hours of those months between the 2 house fires, because they didn't even give the records to us. We don't know. The other thing about that, folks, is this. Detective Looney got on the stand and said, yeah, when Stanley got arrested, keep this in mind, testimony is Stanley gets arrested May 23rd, 2017. Shortly after he gets arrested, Detective Looney testifies, yeah, he called and told someone to set the alarm. Well, he did. He called and told someone to set the alarm. That tells us a couple different things. I think he said he called his son, set the alarm. Tells us his son has the code, number 1, to set the alarm. And it was deactivated on May 24th, the day after he was in the jail. And then, even more importantly, over a month later, on June 28th, and you have these records, the alarm was disarmed again on June 28th of 2017 by Stanley Ford, if you look at the records. Now, we know physically Stanley Ford couldn't possibly have disarmed the alarm on June 28th of 2017 because he has been sitting in the Summit County Jail since May 23rd of 2017. Impossible. Impossible. So somebody else has that code. And that's not for me to sit here, folks, and tell you that Stanley Ford wasn't out of his house on 2016 or 2017 on the night of these fires. I'm not sitting here telling you that. They're telling you it's absolute proof that he started these fires and he's outside those houses. And I'm telling you it's not. That's not proof. He doesn't have to prove anything. He doesn't have to prove he was home sleeping. He doesn't have to prove one thing. They have to prove that he started the fires. He could have went outside. He could have done what the detective over and over, we're going to talk about this, suggested to him that he went down the street to get a look. And he still doesn't mean he set the fires. Just because the alarms go off, and even if it was Stanley Ford, that's not proof that he committed the fire. That's certainly not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not proof of such character that you would rely and act upon it in the most important of your own personal affairs. That's what their whole case is. I told you in the beginning of this case, I promised you a couple things. I promised you, number one, we would never contest there was arsons. I told you we'd never contest the cause or manner of death. And I promised you that this was going to be a whodunit, an academic exercise, that nobody was going to come in here and tell you this wasn't arson, this was an accident, this was an electrical fire, this was a grill that got out of line. None of that. I told you those things, and it's come true. This is a whodunit, it's an academic exercise holding the state to its burden of proof. There is no fingerprint evidence that links Stanley Ford to any of these crimes. Not at either house, not on the gas cap on the January of 2017 case, the shock fire. There is no DNA evidence that links Stanley Ford to any of these matters. There's no eyewitness identification that leads to any of these matters. And outside of, and we're going to talk about these shoes over here, outside of those shoes, there is no forensic evidence that links Stanley Ford to any of these fires. And those shoes don't directly link them either. We heard about this alcohol, or this gas accelerant smelling dog. That's what we heard. And this dog got involved on 2 occasions. He got involved with Mr. Boggs, and we're going to talk about him more, but he got involved with Mr. Boggs when they realized that he had tried to start his ex-wife on fire in the past. So he became a suspect right away, immediately. Because of what he had done to her, poured gasoline or kerosene all over her and tried to light her up. And he'd spent a lot of time in prison. He had just recently got out of prison, and now she's burned up. So he becomes a suspect. They go to his house, and they bring him to the Akron Police Department, and they run that dog by him. And they say that that dog alerts on things. And then they said, well, that's just a presumptive test. And then that dog, then we sent it off to the lab and we confirm or not. And we brought the scientists in to confirm or not, right? That dog hits on where? Hits on that man's socks, that's what they say, right? Walks up to him, sniffs him, and hits on his socks, they say. They never, ever, even though it hit on the socks, they never confiscated Mr. Boggs' shoes. They never had his shoes tested. That dog is hitting right down there. Never got his shoes, never tested his shoes. Just Mr. Ford's shoes. And what they tell you is that we went to do the search warrant in this house. That's when they pulled Stanley out and they put him on the street with Detective Looney, and that's the May 18th, second biggest interview, I guess. And as we do that, we bring that drug dog in there, or that gasoline dog in there, and that dog hits on several things, and we take, and you have the exhibits, his hoodies, his Carhartts, whatever they have that looks like that video from across the way, in 2016, they take all of that stuff. And it all comes back negative. The only positive that we have are these shoes. And these shoes, and they showed you some pictures of them, and you'll have them as exhibits. These shoes are pulled out of a trash can, I believe from 1370 Fultz, and that back little, behind that side door, there's a trash can there. And what do? They dump out that trash can. And they see these shoes through that trash can. And they test those shoes, and there's some positive result. What's in the trash can with the shoes? A bunch of trash. What's on the items that are in the trash? Was there gasoline or some kind of accelerant on those items in the trash that were mixed in with the shoes? They don't test anything else in that trash can. Just what's in the shoes. Just the shoes. How do we know that some other item in that trash didn't have an accelerant on it, and now it's on his shoes? We don't know. They didn't test it. They didn't do those things. I want you to look at those shoes. Those shoes are beat up, right? There's some grass, some dry grass in there. I don't care if he used those shoes to cut the lawn. I don't care if he used those shoes, as they said, and you'll hear in the tapes, to work on the cars in the driveway. Those shoes are old and they're beaten up, and there's some, if you spread the rubber out, there's some slices in the bottom of the soles. So they're all beaten up. Here's what's really interesting. This happens in May of 2017 when they take those shoes out of that house. What's really interesting is those shoes that were placed in the trash have no shoelaces in them. Why don't you just take a look at the condition of them? There's no shoelaces. A man who they claim runs from 693 Fultz from 693 Fultz down Fultz and into this area. They claim it's Stanley. They say he did it, I think, 3 times. No shoelaces? Who takes the shoelaces out of their shoes if they're trying to cover up an arson? I mean, the shoes get gasoline on it, but the shoelaces don't, so we shave the shoelaces? Does that make any sense, that you would pull the shoelaces out? Does it make any sense you would run down the street to start this fire with shoes that had no shoelaces? The shoes are going to fall off his feet. That makes 0 sense. But that's what's in the trash can, along with whatever else is in the trash can that was never tested. The keypad, I asked Detective Looney, anyone check the keypad at 1374 Hillcrest shortly after the 2016 fire, or shortly after the 2017 truck fire, or shortly after the 2000 and, I said 16, I meant 17 the first time, 17 house fire. Did anyone at any point in time check that pad for fingerprints or DNA? And I said to him, I said, you know what? If my fingerprint or DNA was on my kitchen countertop, that wouldn't surprise you, right? It wouldn't surprise you because it's my kitchen countertop. But if somebody was in my house and their fingerprint was on my kitchen countertop and they had no business being in my house, that might be indicative of somebody who we want to have as a suspect. So I'm not saying check those fingerprints to see if Stanley Ford's are there. He's in and out of there all the time. I'm saying, did you check the fingerprints or the DNA on that keypad shortly after any one of those 3 fires to see whether or not somebody's DNA or fingerprints were there that shouldn't have been there? Might be somebody we want to talk to. And I asked him, I said, you know, there are bad people in this state, and when they have a bad person in the state, the police department keeps a bank of information where we know known felons' fingerprints and DNA, and we can compare it to crime scenes when we find unknown fingerprints and DNA to see if there's a match. Did we do any of that in this case? Absolutely not. Same thing for that door at 1370. Did we check DNA or fingerprints at the door at 1370 that is supposedly creaking open on the side? Absolutely not. None of that is done. How about the DVR, by the way? I'm going to force the 2017 fire of the guy who's right here. I asked him about that. We couldn't pronounce his name. That was really late in the testimony of this trial. Did we ever pull that DVR? No. How about on East Avenue up here? How about on East Avenue? Because we learned that Stanley O. Mitchell lives right down here on East Avenue, right off of it. There's a Catholic Charities there with a video. Did we pull that DVR to see what was on that DVR? No. Didn't do that either. Andrew Buxco. That's the guy that lived over here with his camera pointed straight at 693 volts. Never saw that video. Never even tried to see that video. let's talk about the 2017 fire. May of 2017. I want to focus on two people that are interviewed by Detective Looney in May of 2017. First of all, I want to talk about Miss Beverly Ewing. I asked Miss Beverly Ewing specifically, when you were interviewed, actually I think it was Weitzel that interviewed her, but he's the lead detective, so he's aware of the information. When you were interviewed, you were asked about suspicious people in the neighborhood who could have done this. She said yes. I said, what did you tell them? And she said, in the days and a month or so preceding the 2017 house fire, almost every night there was a suspicious black vehicle that pulled up on Hillcrest, about here, parked between 9 and 10 p.m. at night, almost every night, and the person never got out of the car. Until, she said, the morning after the fire. What does she tell us about the morning after the fire? First of all, she tells us, to recreate the scene, she tells us that there are fire trucks and police everywhere. There is a burnt up house at 693 Fultz. And anybody who has any sense about that whatsoever, who is in the neighborhood on the daylight hours of that morning, would know that there was an enormous house fire. That's what she tells us. And she says, this suspicious car that pulled up for an hour at a time from 9 to 10 most nights and parked there with nobody getting out, for the first time ever, the neighbors are out and about, people are talking in the neighborhood, this person gets out of the vehicle. And she says this person has a big smile on his face, which she finds to be very suspicious. And he makes the comment, what, did somebody get shot? And then he says, well, that's just black on black crime. He's a black man, by the way. That's what she says. That's just black on black crime. With a big smile on his face, and she finds him to be very suspicious. She says he then gets back in his car, and I specifically asked her, did he ever, after that morning, ever come back into that neighborhood to your knowledge? Did you ever see him again? And she says no. So the police are aware of that in May of 2017. They interviewed Stanley Ford, either on the 17th or 18th. It was on the tape and we heard it. And they're asking Stanley about the neighborhood that night, that day. And Stanley Ford tells them, I called the police, tells Detective Looney that, I called the police. There was a suspicious black vehicle right here that drove up with its lights off, and parked right there. And I called the police. There's an exhibit, folks, that you're going to get. And then when I asked Detective Looney about it, he goes, it says anonymous. We don't know who called. I said, the caller information is from 1374 Hillcrest. And he goes, well, we don't know if that's Stanley. I said, Detective, you interviewed Stanley Ford. He didn't want to give this up, of course. You interviewed Stanley Ford, and he told you about this vehicle prior to the nights of fire. He told you that he saw this, and he had called the police. And I said, using the powers of deduction, Detective, and your experience as a detective, the fact that it comes from 1374 Hillcrest and Stanley Ford before he saw the report told you about it, we can conclude Stanley Ford called the police and talked about the suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood. And he said yes. I want you to pay attention to that defense exhibit. That happened, folks, on April 13th of 2017, about 1 month prior to this fire. 1 month prior, Stanley Ford is calling the police about a suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood and describing it. And he gives the detective, or it's on the police report, provides the license plate number of the vehicle to the Akron Police Department. I asked Detective Looney, I said, Detective, this exhibit that I've given you, Your office, your department provided this to us in discovery. That's when we get the evidence. They have that evidence. I asked them, did anybody check to see who owns that car? Never once. They don't even know to this day. Wouldn't it be nice to know who the owner of that vehicle was and question them about what they were doing? Wouldn't it be nice? That's outrageous. And guess what? Guess what? Stanley Ford's story, the fact that he called the police, and the fact that there really was a suspicious vehicle in that neighborhood, you don't even have to take Stanley's word for it. He didn't make it up. Beverly Ewing told the police the same darn thing. And guess what the time of that was that the call was made by Stanley Ford? 21:42 hours. 21:42 hours. That's 9:42 at night. It completely corroborates with what Mrs. Ewing said, Beverly Ewing. She said between 9 and 10 every night. He calls at 21:42 hours and talks about that. And we have no idea as we sit here, 9 people dead. We have no idea who the owner of that car is. That's outrageous. You want to talk about suspect? You want to talk about reasonable doubt? Let's just forget about that. In May of 2017, let's forget about all that. Let's get somebody because we're under extreme pressure to charge. Because we've had 3 fires in this case, in that neighborhood. Let's forget about all that. Well, guess what, folks? Today's the day of reckoning. We can't forget about that stuff. We cannot forget about the reasonable doubt in this case. Follow the evidence. That's evidence. You don't have those answers. They didn't provide them to you. They didn't do their job. Please take the time to look at that report. It's critical. Do I know that the person, the suspicious vehicle that was sitting there, is the person that started that fire? Absolutely not. I don't know. I'm not God. But I know it should have been looked into. I know we should have crossed our T's and dotted our I's before we charge somebody with these heinous crimes. Patrick Boggs. Let's talk about Patrick Boggs. Talked about him a little bit, I'll try not to repeat. Patrick Boggs, when he's picked up, he's brought to the Portage County Jail. And there's an exhibit from the Akron Beacon Journal of May 17th of 2021. He's in the jail, and you heard, and Detective Looney said, we learned that the Akron Beacon Journal is provided to in the cell block of the pod, so if you want to read the Akron Beacon Journal, it's there for you. First of all, I'll tell you that there is not one shred of evidence in this case that this Mr. Selby, who says Boggs confessed to him, there's not one shred of evidence that he actually read the Akron Beacon Journal. Okay? They want you to assume he did, right? But here's a fact. You're going to see that article, and you're going to recall my questioning of Detective Looney. First of all, I said, Detective Looney, you know in 2001, because you got the file from when he's trying to set Angela Boggs on fire, you know that was racially motivated and made him a suspect in this case, Mr. Boggs. And he said yes. He thought, Mr. Boggs back then, that she's having an affair with a black man. Mr. Boggs is a racist. And he said yes. Mr. Boggs is a racist. Boggs didn't like that, so he tried to set his wife on fire. He goes and does his prison term. And what do we know now? Angela Boggs has children now with a black man. We know Boggs doesn't like that. And here's what we also know. We know, even if you want to assume, and that's an assumption, it's not a fact, that Selby, the inmate, read the Beacon Journal. We know from reading the Beacon Journal Journal article from the 17th of May. By the way, this conversation with Boggs takes place on the 21st of May, 4 days later. We know that nowhere in that Akron Beacon Journal article does it talk about the racial motivation for Mr. Boggs to go and try and burn down 693 volts. Doesn't say it in there. How would Selby, it wasn't in the Akron Beacon Journal article, he was making it up as the prosecutor wants you to think. How would Selby know about the racial motivation of Boggs to go after Angela Boggs because she was living with a black man, unless Boggs himself told him that? What do we know? We know from the deputies that came through Detective Looney, we know the deputies in the Portage County Jail on the 21st of May of 2017 witnessed Boggs out of his cell and Selby out of his cell, and they were conversing throughout the day. So we know they talked. We know when Selby pressed that intercom to come talk to the deputy, Boggs was in his cell right next door, and Selby didn't want to talk. He was scared. He motioned towards Boggs' cell and said, I want to talk to you, but not here. Bring me down the hall. I don't want to talk out loud. Bring me down the hall. And we know in that police report that was furnished by the Portage County Sheriff to Detective Looney's office, we know that as he got down the hall, he was shaken. That's what's in the report, that Selby was shaken by this. And he said, that guy killed a family in Akron. He confessed to me. I can't believe he did it. He actually killed one of his own children. Now, if you read the Beacon Journal article, there is a Boggs listed as one of the deceased, one of the older child. I get that. But nowhere in that article does it speak to the fact that it was racially motivated. On top of that, folks, I want you to remember this about Boggs. I asked Detective Looney specifically about this. I said, Detective Looney, you interviewed some people that were family members to people that perished in that fire. I said, namely, Brittany Boggs, the daughter who was off at Cedar Point, remember that? And you interviewed Ty Huggins, the son of Dennis Huggins, who lived in Indiana at the time Dennis Huggins had kicked him out of the house about 3 weeks earlier. And he said yes, and I said, what you learned from those two folks was that Patrick Boggs was actually on Fulton Street dropping Brittany Boggs off. Brittany Boggs told you that, and Ty Huggins witnessed it on at least 2 occasions outside of 693 volts. And when you, that's important, because when you interviewed Mr. Boggs, detective, you know he lied to you. He lied to you because you asked him if he had ever been over there before, and he denied ever being on that street. And Detective Looney said, yes, I knew he was lying. Why does Boggs lie about that? He had been over there. He did know where that location was. He knew where Angela Boggs was. And he's a racist, and he can't stand the fact that she's with Mr. Huggins. Isn't that important? We talk about the porch and the charcoal, right? And it's in the article, it was done with charcoal. Read that article. It talks about charcoal, but it also talks about going in a trash bag or something like that with charcoal. No one's saying the fire started on the porch. Couldn't there have been charcoal on the porch that was used in that part at that party? And couldn't some of that have been put in that trash can that burnt down to the ground to help start that fire with an accelerant? Couldn't they have taken some of the partially used charcoal, put it in the trash can, poured gasoline on it, poof, and the can goes down to nothing as they showed you in the picture? Nothing. Couldn't that be accurate? Couldn't that have been what Boggs told him? I don't know because I wasn't there. But I know Mr. Selby has information that is not in that article, and I know there's no proof that he ever even read the article. They want to say that he couldn't have done it because his cell phone wasn't there. First of all, I heard testimony about 3 cell phones that were connected to his name. Only one of which they had cell phone towers hitting off of in Ravenna for. The other one, Tracy Evans, is Boggs' sister, and we heard that he had one of Tracy Evans' phones too. But we also heard that the information about where those phones were and what calls they made stopped on 2 of those phones on May 11th. The fire happened on May 15th. Those cell phones are useless to us. They don't confirm where he is. The fact that his car or truck is at the scene or at his apartment doesn't mean he didn't go to Akron and do these things. I wouldn't want to take my truck on scene either if I was going to do what he did, potentially, right? Once again, I don't know if he did it or not, but he's a suspect. I wouldn't want to take my phone either. I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist to do those things. That means nothing. That doesn't eliminate him as a suspect. It does if you have a lot of pressure on you to find somebody and arrest them. I don't know Dennis Huggins, never met him. But I do know he was a drug dealer. He sold weed. I know that because it came out in the testimony presented by the state. I know that there was an argument at his house the night before, or the day of, excuse me. And I know from Tiffany Gary, and I'll use her words, there were a lot of dudes in and out of that place. I do know that about it. Do I know if any of those people had anything to do with this? Absolutely not. But I do know that those are facts in this case. Interestingly, when you compare 2016 to 2017 in the fires, interestingly, don't know if it means anything, but before the start of the second attempt at 2016, we see a vehicle come down, turn, and stop. And what do we hear from Tanisha Stewart? In the video shows the lights go out. That's kind of interesting because in 2017, what do we hear from Stanley Ford when he calls the police about the suspicious vehicle in the neighborhood? The car's driving without the lights on. Kind of interesting. Let's talk about Stanley's statements. First of all, I want you to keep in mind, May of 2017, May 23rd, 2017, they bring him to the police station. That interview, folks, by their own account, he was in that interview room for well over 3 hours. He was interviewed for well over 2 hours. But they're only playing 15 minutes of that interview for you. They're not playing the whole interview. You don't get to hear that. You got 15 minutes of it. They talk to him on May 17th, they talk to him on May 18th. They bring him out on May 18th, and they put him in a car, and they interview him in the car, and talk to him. I think that's an hour and a half long. And then the interview, and I want you to be fooled again, on May 23rd, is not that 15 minutes. It's well over 2 hours of interview, and you don't get to know. Objection.
Sustained. The jury will disregard. Also, closing arguments are not evidence and shall not be considered by you during your deliberation.
Detective Looney told you from the stand that that interview was over 2 hours long. You're going to hear 15 minutes of it. What do we know about Detective Looney? We know he's gone through the police academy. We know he's a detective in the Akron Police Department. And we know he got training as a detective in the Akron Police Department. We know, as he said so from the stand, that he was familiar with interviewing, interrogating techniques. And oh, by the way, yeah, I guess I had a course on the read technique that I was talking about. We know all that. We know he's got a bachelor's degree. We know he's got a master's degree. We know he's got a doctorate. I said, you're an educated man. Clearly he is. Very educated. Very well versed. He knows how to interview people. The prosecutor got up after I talked about the read technique and he said, the Supreme Court says it's okay for you to lie to these folks. He says it's okay for you to not give him all the information. Right? That's what he said. Detective Lewis said, yeah. I don't have to tell him the truth. It's part of the interviewing process. The Supreme Court said it's okay. That doesn't mean, folks, you cannot weigh that evidence for what it's worth and consider who Detective Looney and Detective Johnny Bell are compared to who Stanley Ford is sitting in that car and sitting in that interview room and where he is. And I ask you to listen to his responses, the language he uses compared to what they do. And I'm going to tell you that he is no match for him intellectually. And I think that's apparent. Not only is it not a match intellectually for him, there's no hitting somebody over the head with a phone book or anything like that, but there is browbeating, mental browbeating that goes on in these interrogations. And they use the Reed technique to do it. And they try and wear people down and they mislead people and they don't tell them the truth about what's going on in hopes, folks, that they're going to confess. This is an intelligent jury. There are false confessions in this world. Objection.
Sustained. There was no confession, and we're not going to talk about false confessions. You'll disregard Mr. Gorman's statement and remember that closing arguments are not evidence and shall not be considered by you during your deliberations.
And I'm not telling you Stanley Ford confesses he didn't. I'm asking you to look at the psychological manipulation that took place in those interviews and that mental beatdown of him to try and get him down this street. That happened, and it happened the entire time it was going on. First they befriend him, they're nice to him. They tell him how much they respect him. They tell him all those things throughout the process. They tell him, when he won't tell him he was down the street, we see you going down the street. They don't show him the video. Because you know why they don't show him the video? Because they know they don't see him going down the street. Objection. It's argument.
All right, it is argument, and the jury will rely on its collective memories as to what the evidence shows or does not show, and that is totally your purview as the trier of fact. So again, remember that closing arguments are not evidence and should not be considered by you during your deliberation.
They tell him that. I'm not making it up. It's on the tape. We see you going down the street. We see you. If it was so strong, folks, they wouldn't need to browbeat him for hours to try and get him to say he was down the street. If this evidence is so strong. What do? They take him out of his house, in front of his family, they put him in a cruiser, they drive him down to downtown, they bring him up on the 6th floor of the Detective Bureau, in handcuffs. They tell him he's being charged with all of these aggravated murders. They've already decided. If you've already decided, why we got to talk to Stanley? When they tell him that, they handcuff him to a table so he can't move, and they leave him in the room for a while. And I asked Detective Looney, that's an interrogation technique. No. No, we're just getting our stories straight here. We're getting our questioning in line before we go in there. You can believe that if you want to. But they let him sit in that room, chained to that table, told he's charged with aggravated murder, and then they come in. And then the Reed technique takes over. We already know you did it. That's what they're telling them. We just want to know why. Why is that an element of this crime, folks? Why is not an element of this crime? We just want to know why. Maybe, Stanley, you went down just to take a look. Maybe, Stanley, you went down there, it was an accident. Maybe, Stanley, you just wanted them out of the house, you set the fire and it got out of control. Stanley, 7 people are dead in that fire. Children, Stanley, I got to go back and I got to answer to the family, Stanley. Help me out, Stanley. Help me out. Over and over and over and over again. And you get 15 minutes of it. That's what you get. over and over. Stanley says, man, the timeline ain't adding up. I'm paraphrasing now, you'll listen to it. The timeline ain't adding up. It ain't adding up. I didn't do that, man. Johnny Bell, I didn't do that. I didn't do that over and over and over again. As they continuously psychologically beat him down to get him down the street. Think about yourself. Put yourself in that position. You're already charged with aggravated murder. They already believe you did it. They're here intellectually, you're here. They've already decided to arrest you. They're telling you they're watching you walk down the street on video, but they won't show it to you. You're in that room trying to placate those gentlemen. You're trying not to make them mad because they got the charging decision in their hands. And they're telling you they're down the street. You scramble. You're scrambling for answers as you sit in that room. You're trying not to upset the detectives who are very upset already. How much worse can this get? Maybe I should say I went down the street. But I didn't do anything. I didn't do anything. I didn't do this. That's not the right timeline. That's what we hear in this case. That's what you hear. The day before, they bring him in the car. And they purposely put him in the car, and they have him watch all these different law enforcement agencies out there searching his house. And they tell him, we get it right. We get it right. We got to get it right. They interview him out there, and the same stuff happens. Not to the level you're seeing on 2023, but, or on May 23rd, but the same stuff is going on. The read techniques being employed. Psychological manipulation is being employed. And you have to ask yourself, it's so important. Again, I'll say it again. If it was such an open and shut case, because we got it on video, the grainy figure on video, the door cracking, and we've got an alarm system, and in the alarm system we got it being deactivated, it says Stanley Ford. If it's such a great case, why do they got to get him to confess? Why are they pressing him so hard? It doesn't make sense. If that's enough evidence, why do we got to go there? Why do we got to keep doing it? Why do we got to tell him we need to know why? Why do we got to give him all these outs so he goes down the street in his statement? You sit down. I can't get up and answer whatever he's going to say. You folks have listened to this evidence, paid attention in this case. I'm going to ask you to take the law the judge provides you, not the law that we believe is, the law the judge provides you. I'm going to ask you to embrace, because that's what the law calls us to do, the reasonable doubt definition. I want you to recall how high of a burden that is no matter what they say. proof of such character that an ordinary person would be willing to rely and act upon it in deciding the most important of their own affairs. You know, sometimes, you know, prosecutors, when they have like Mr. Hughley as witnesses and you know, and God rest his soul, sometimes, you know, they have people that aren't the greatest people in the world, Mr. McElmore and everything, and they talk about their witnesses, and you know, they say things like, well, if crime happens in hell, you're not going to have angels for witnesses. Sometimes they say those things, right? Because what they're saying basically is, and they haven't said that in this case, but sometimes people want you to not focus on the credibility and assessing the credibility of people, which you have to do, no matter where they come from, no matter what their backgrounds are, you have to assess their credibility. You can't ignore their credibility just to come from a place that you don't like. So don't be fooled by any of that. What happened in this case, folks, is absolutely horrific. It's horrific what happened to two families in this case. Horrific. It can't be undone. Everybody's heart goes out to the families in this case. That's not why we're here. We're here to give Mr. Ford a fair trial and to hold the state of Ohio, because that's what civilized societies do, to its burden of proof. I don't get to decide whether he did this or they proved it. The judge doesn't, prosecutors don't, Detective Moody doesn't either. It's the greatest system in the world when we ask people to come in here and spend a month of their time as jurors. Outside of serving in the military, it's the greatest honor, the best commitment, the biggest commitment we can have to give back to this country. This flawed country that is constantly recreating itself and hopefully becoming better. But it doesn't work unless we get a cross-section of this community, which we have. People from different backgrounds, people from different genders, people from different races and probably religions, come in here, right, and sacrifice on such a horrible case their time and pay attention like you folks have paid attention in this case. Take my hat off to you for the job you're doing and you're going to continue to do. When I ask you to do justice, I ask you to look at this case in an academic exercise and not let the emotion of it get in the way of rendering a just verdict. A just verdict. That verdict, folks, in this case, as hard as it can be, because we want someone to be held accountable for what happened in that neighborhood over a 13-month period of time. I get that. But that verdict, folks, is not guilty. We talked about the difference between not guilty and innocent. As I sit here today, I can't tell you what happened. I wasn't there. Neither were you folks. Neither were the police. It's not guilty. They haven't met that high verdict. And I quote, I don't think Stanley could do this to that family. And that quote, folks, came not from our witness, from theirs. It came from Audrey Taylor, who came in from Pennsylvania on that video. She said, as I asked her, I said, what did you prep for the case? Did you talk to Mr. D'Angelo? Yeah, I talked to him several times. Did you talk about your prior statement? No. Did you read your report about what they said you said? No. What I told Mr. D'Angelo was, wow, these family could have done that to that family. Now, she said, I went up that street for years, and I saw Stanley out there cutting his lawn. Following and tow behind him were his two daughters, with their 21 lawnmowers following their dad cutting their lawn. He's got a family. He's got little kids. I don't think he could have done that. The prosecutor stands up and says, well, you didn't see the video evidence, did you, ma'am? No, she didn't see the video evidence. She lives in that neighborhood. She saw Stanley. She saw Stanley with his family. I don't think Stanley could have done this. Please, I implore you to hold the state of Ohio to that burden, that totality of the circumstances and the facts in this case, there's reasonable doubt all over it. And you can leave that jury room, you can let this judge know that you've reached a verdict when you're ready, when you're good and ready. And you can come back out here and you can say, Mr. Ford is not guilty of these crimes. And you can keep your head up and walk out of here proud of the fact that you held this state to its burden of proof. You upheld the Constitution in doing so. It's not guilty, folks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Gorman. Mr. LaPrenzi.
Maybe spend an hour and a half.
Sure. All right,
Just short.
we're just gonna. Do you need to, let's do this. Anybody need a break? All right, well, that seems to be the general consensus of this trial, isn't it? Okay, we are going to go ahead and take a 15-minute break until 4 o'clock. Remember the admonition I've previously given you, don't talk about the, hold on, let's not lose focus. It's imperative that you not talk about the case amongst yourselves or with anyone else. This includes family, friends, and the media. Do not post or read anything about this. Do not discuss it amongst yourselves or with anyone else. And do not permit anyone to discuss it with you. You may think you've received everything, but you haven't. You haven't received the last part of closing argument by the state, and you have not received my final arguments. So we'll take a 15-minute break. You'll be back at 4 o'clock, and we'll finish with closing arguments and instructions.
All right, please. Notepads, face down on your chair.